The chaos after Pharsalus, Rome in crisis. The dust had barely settled on the battlefield of Pharsalus, and the true consequences of Julius Caesar's victory began to unfold. The defeat of Pompey the Great had sent shockwaves through the Roman world, but it was not the end of the civil war. Far from it. Rome was now an empire without an equilibrium, a kingdom without a crown, and while Caesar pursued Pompey across the Mediterranean, the forces of resistance regrouped. Pharsalus had broken Pompey's hold on Rome, but it had not broken the spirit of his allies. The Senate, divided yet still powerful, found new leaders willing to fight. In the provinces, loyalist commanders refused to surrender. In North Africa, Spain, and the far reaches of Asia Minor, war was brewing. Caesar may have won the battle, but he had not yet won the war. But as Rome teetered on the brink of an even greater crisis, Caesar was not in Italy to secure his victory. He was in Egypt, entangled in the web of dynastic intrigue between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII. What should have been a swift pursuit of Pompey had turned into a prolonged campaign for influence in the East. And while Caesar indulged in Alexandria, the world he sought to control threatened to slip from his grasp. This was the beginning of a new phase of the Civil War, one in which Caesar, despite his victories, would find himself constantly on the defensive, because while he was occupied in the East, new threats emerged in the West, and the most dangerous of them all was in a place few had expected, Pontus. While Caesar fought in Egypt, Rome was left under the command of Mark Antony, a loyal general but an unstable politician. Antony ruled Rome with a heavy hand. His governance was marked by excess, corruption, and alienation of the Senate. While he sought to consolidate power for Caesar's eventual return, his mismanagement only deepened the divide between the Caesarians and the Pompeians. The Senate, already bitter over its diminished role, found new leaders rising from the chaos. Cato and Scipio had rallied Pompeian forces in North Africa. Sextus Pompey had begun building his own power base in Spain and in Asia Minor. An old enemy of Rome saw an opportunity. That man was Pharnaces II, the son of Mithridates VI, the legendary king of Pontus who had waged war against Rome for decades. With Caesar distracted and Rome in disarray, Pharnaces sought his chance to reclaim his father's lost kingdom. Pharnaces had always lived in the shadow of his father. Mithridates VI, the great enemy of Rome, had defied the Republic for over 40 years. His wars against Sulla, Lucullus, and Pompey had been some of the most brutal conflicts in Roman history. Though he was eventually defeated, his legend endured. He was a king who had nearly driven Rome out of Asia, and now, his son sought to complete what he had started. When Pharnaces saw that Rome was engulfed in civil war, he acted swiftly. He led his forces into Armenia, then into Cappadocia. One by one, Roman client kingdoms fell under his control. By the time news of his conquests reached Rome, Pharnaces had already consolidated his rule over the heartlands of Pontus. To Rome, this was an act of defiance that could not be ignored. The Republic had fought too hard to subdue Asia Minor to allow a rogue king to reclaim it. But with Caesar in Egypt and the Senate weakened, the task of stopping Pharnaces fell to one of Caesar's trusted generals, Gnaeus Domitius Calvinus. Domitius Calvinus was an experienced commander, but he was not Caesar. He had fought in the Civil War and had proven himself loyal, but he was now faced with an enemy unlike any he had encountered before. His first challenge was assembling an army. With most of Rome's legions tied up in the Civil War, Domitius had to rely on local forces, troops from Galatia, Cappadocia, and other client states. These were men who had been trained in Roman warfare, but lacked the discipline and battle-hardened experience of Caesar's veterans. Domitius marched north, determined to confront Pharnaces before he could advance further. The two armies met near the city of Nicopolis, a strategic stronghold in Pontus. Domitius, confident in his numbers, believed he could force a decisive engagement, but Pharnaces had other plans. He lured Domitius into a false sense of security, allowing the Romans to believe they had the advantage. Then, in a sudden and brutal assault, Pharnaces unleashed his full strength. His forces, composed of experienced cavalry and hardened infantry, overwhelmed the Roman lines. Domitius, caught off guard, tried to reorganize his troops, but it was too late. The battle turned into a rout. The Romans were crushed. Pharnaces had done what his father had failed to do. He had defeated a Roman army in open battle. Domitius barely escaped with his life. His forces were shattered, and as he fled south, Pharnaces marched forward, executing Roman prisoners and slaughtering those who resisted him. It was a humiliation that Rome had not suffered in years, and it sent a clear message. The East was vulnerable. Rome's grip on its provinces was slipping. If Pharnaces was not stopped, he would not only reclaim Pontus, he would take the whole of Asia Minor. When word of Domitius' defeat reached Caesar, he knew there was no time to waste. He had spent months in Egypt securing Cleopatra's rule, but now he had a new war to fight. His enemies in Rome were still regrouping. His political situation was far from stable. But if he did not act quickly, the entire eastern frontier could be lost. And so, in one of the most daring military campaigns of his career, Caesar made his move. He did not wait to assemble a full army. He did not linger to strategize. Instead, he did what he always did. He moved fast. With a small force of veterans, he set out for Asia Minor. He would not waste time rebuilding Domitius' army. He would not allow Pharnaces to entrench himself further. He would strike immediately, before his enemy could prepare. And thus, the campaign that would give birth to one of the most famous phrases in history, Veni, Vidi, Vici, had begun. As Caesar marched toward Pontus, he knew that this was more than just another battle. It was a statement, a reminder that Rome's legions, under his command, could not be challenged. Pharnaces had won his victory at Nicopolis. He had humiliated a Roman general, but now, he would face Caesar himself. What followed would be one of the fastest, most decisive victories in military history, a battle that would last mere hours, but would define the power of Caesar's leadership for eternity. Caesar's lightning war, strategy and speed. War does not wait for convenience. It moves like a storm, shifting with every decision, every hesitation, every moment lost. And Julius Caesar understood this better than anyone. When news of Gnaeus Domitius Calvinus' crushing defeat at Nicopolis reached him in Egypt, he did not have the luxury of time. His mind, ever calculating, processed the dire reality in an instant. Rome's presence in the East was slipping. Pharnaces II had proven himself more than a mere opportunist. And worst of all, Caesar's enemies in Rome were growing bolder by the day. The Republic was fragile, and Caesar had already spent too long in Egypt dealing with the tangled politics of Cleopatra's court. If he delayed further, he risked losing not just the East, but his grip on power altogether. He had no choice. He had to move. And when Caesar moved, the world took notice. Caesar's march from Egypt to Asia Minor was nothing short of legendary. Few generals would have dared to make such a journey with so little preparation. Yet for Caesar, speed was everything. He did not wait for reinforcements or the perfect conditions. He improvised as he went, solving logistical problems on the move. With only a handful of veteran legions, he sailed across the Mediterranean, landing in Syria before pressing into Cilicia. Every step of the way, he gathered forces where he could, called upon allies, and reassured Rome's provincial governors that his presence meant stability. But more powerful than his army was his reputation. The name Caesar alone carried weight. Across the East, Pharnaces' men whispered of his victories. They spoke of his triumph at Pharsalus, of his conquest of Gaul, of the legions that had marched through rain, snow, and desert to claim victory after victory. Many in Pharnaces' ranks had fought under Pompey and knew firsthand what Caesar's and were capable of. Caesar understood the power of perception. His arrival alone was a weapon, a psychological strike against Pharnaces before a single sword was drawn. Upon reaching Asia Minor, Caesar did not waste time. He met with Diaturus, the client king of Galatia, whose forces had been scattered in Domitius' failed campaign. The remnants of Rome's battered army, shaken and disorganized, needed a leader who could restore their confidence. And if there was one thing Caesar could do better than any man alive, it was rally soldiers to his cause. He took stock of his situation. His army was smaller than Pharnaces and far from its supply lines. Many of his troops were fresh recruits, untested in battle. But Caesar had fought with worse odds before. He had no time for hesitation. Rome needed him elsewhere. He could not afford a long, drawn-out campaign. He would finish this war in a single battle. Pharnaces, emboldened by his victory over Domitius, believed he had the upper hand. He sent envoys to Caesar, offering peace terms that would allow him to keep his conquests. It was a bold move, one that revealed just how little Pharnaces understood his opponent. Caesar did not negotiate from a position of weakness. He rejected the offer outright. If Pharnaces thought he could carve out a kingdom while Rome was distracted, he had made a fatal mistake. Caesar marched straight for Zela, a strategically vital city in Pontus, forcing Pharnaces into battle on ground of his choosing. The Roman commander had seen this strategy before. Pharnaces, like his father Mithridates VI before him, relied on maneuverability and terrain advantages. But Caesar had learned from history. He would not allow Pharnaces to dictate the terms of the fight. The morning of battle arrived, and Pharnaces made the first move. Confident in his numbers, he launched a surprise assault on Caesar's camp, attempting to catch the Romans off guard. But this was not an army of frightened recruits, it was an army led by Julius Caesar. When the enemy charged, Caesar's reaction was not panic, but amusement. He is said to have laughed at Pharnaces' arrogance, knowing that the attack was a miscalculation. Pharnaces had underestimated the discipline of the Roman legions, assuming that speed alone would break their ranks. But Caesar's men were trained for this. They absorbed the charge, held their formation, and in an instant, turned defense into offense. The counterattack was swift and brutal. Pharnaces' troops, realizing too late that their surprise assault had failed, began to break under the relentless pressure of Rome's veterans. The battle lasted mere hours. The outcome was never in doubt. Pharnaces, witnessing the collapse of his army, fled the field, leaving his men to be slaughtered. His once mighty force, which had humiliated Domitius, was now in ruins. The eastern threat was extinguished before it could truly take root. It was a textbook display of Caesar's tactical brilliance, but more than that, it was a statement. In the aftermath of the battle, Caesar did something that would define his legacy for generations to come. He sent a message back to Rome, just 3 words: Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. Never before had a victory been summarized so perfectly. It was not just a declaration of triumph, it was a demonstration of power, a reminder to Rome, to his enemies, and to history itself that Caesar was unstoppable. But what did it truly mean? Was it a boast of military genius? A warning to those who opposed him? Or was it something more? A glimpse into the mind of a man who believed himself destined to rule. The war with Pharnaces had lasted mere days. The battle itself had lasted mere hours. But the impact of Caesar's victory at Zela would last for centuries. With the East secure, he could finally turn his attention back to Rome. But what awaited him there was not peace. It was another war, another challenge, another step toward the ultimate fate that history had prepared for him. The phrase Veni, Vidi, Vici was more than just a battle cry. It was a philosophy, a way of life, and to understand its true meaning, we must look beyond the battlefield and into the world that Caesar was about to return to. Because while he had won the war, his greatest battle was still ahead. The meaning of Veni, Vidi, Vici, Caesar's legacy in the East. Few phrases in history carry the weight of Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. It is a statement of absolute dominance, a declaration of victory so swift and complete that it needed no embellishment. With these 3 words, Julius Caesar did more than announce a military triumph. He crafted a legend. But what did this phrase really mean? Was it just the boast of a victorious general, or was it something more? A display of political genius? A warning to his enemies? A glimpse into the mind of a man who was rapidly moving beyond the boundaries of a mere military leader and into the realm of absolute power? To understand the true significance of Veni, Vidi, Vici, we must look beyond the battlefield at Zela and into the larger forces at play. Caesar's use of propaganda, the fragility of Rome's empire, and the historical echoes of his rapid campaign in the East. The Battle of Zela was over in mere hours, but its consequences lasted for centuries. Pharnaces II, the son of Rome's old enemy Mithridates VI, had overestimated his own strength. He had won a victory over a Roman general and assumed he could carve out a kingdom while the Republic was in chaos. But he made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed he would have time. Caesar's march to Zela was relentless. He refused to allow Pharnaces to fortify his position or consolidate power. He struck before the enemy was ready, forcing a battle on his terms. And when the fight began, Pharnaces' forces collapsed almost immediately. The survivors fled in panic. Pharnaces himself barely escaped with his life. What happened next was brutal and effective. Caesar did not simply win. He made an example of his enemy. Pharnaces' remaining forces were scattered. Roman prisoners taken during the earlier battle at Nicopolis were executed. Cities that had defected to Pharnaces were punished, their leaders put to the sword. Order was restored with unquestionable force. But here is where Caesar's genius becomes clear. He did not linger. Unlike other Roman commanders, who might have engaged in prolonged campaigns of suppression, Caesar had no interest in wasting time in the east. His true enemies were back in Rome, and he knew he could not afford to be away for long. And so, with incredible speed, he wrapped up the war, secured the region, and left. Zela had been less about military conquest and more about political efficiency. To understand why Veni, Vidi, Vici became such an iconic phrase, we must first understand why the speed of the campaign mattered more than the victory itself. Roman wars in the east had always been long and drawn-out affairs. Pompey the Great had spent years battling Mithridates VI, Lucullus had campaigned endlessly before him. But Caesar, he crushed the eastern threat in mere days. In doing so, he sent a powerful message. Rome's enemies would no longer be given the luxury of time. There would be no back-and-forth struggles, no drawn-out conflicts, only swift and decisive action. This approach reshaped how Rome dealt with resistance. For centuries, the eastern provinces had been difficult to govern, prone to rebellion and defiance. But after Caesar, the idea of quick, overwhelming retaliation became standard practice. Governors and generals learned from his methods, recognizing that hesitation could invite disaster. More importantly, Caesar's speed was psychological warfare. It reinforced the idea that he was unstoppable, a force of nature rather than just a man. He did not wage wars. He ended them, and that was a terrifying prospect for anyone who stood against him. Caesar did not just rely on military strength. He knew how to use fear and reputation as weapons. The defeat of Pharnaces was more than just another victory. It was a statement, a reminder to Rome's enemies that resistance was futile, that opposing Caesar did not lead to drawn-out conflicts, it led to annihilation. This was a stark contrast to Pompey, who had struggled for years against Mithridates, where Pompey had negotiated, delayed, and waged campaigns for nearly a decade. Caesar crushed Mithridates' son in a single stroke. This difference was not lost on the Roman people. By winning so quickly, Caesar proved that he was not just another general, he was the greatest general of his time. This victory also reinforced his control over the Senate and the people of Rome. Even those who feared him could not deny his brilliance. His enemies, who still plotted against him, knew that they were running out of options. But history is fragile. Victories shape empires, but so do defeats. What if Caesar had failed at Zela? What if Pharnaces had held his ground, forcing Caesar into a prolonged campaign? Had the war dragged on, the consequences for Rome would have been severe. Pharnaces could have solidified his rule over Pontus. Rome's eastern provinces would have fallen into chaos, with other client kings questioning their loyalty. Caesar's political standing would have weakened. His rivals in Rome, Cato, Scipio, and the Pompeian loyalists, would have seized on the failure as proof that he was not invincible. Rome's enemies elsewhere might have been emboldened. A prolonged campaign in the east could have encouraged the Pompeian forces in North Africa and Spain to strike while Caesar was occupied. In short, a drawn-out war in Asia Minor might have changed the course of history. It could have delayed Caesar's return to Rome, allowed his enemies to consolidate power, and perhaps even prevented him from becoming dictator. But that did not happen, because Caesar did not give Pharnaces the chance. With Pharnaces defeated and the east secure, Caesar could finally turn his attention back to Rome. But while he had been fighting in the east, Rome had been unraveling. His allies had struggled to keep order. His enemies had grown bolder. The Senate had not forgotten the civil war, and those who had fled after Pharsalus had begun regrouping in North Africa and Spain. For Caesar, this was not the end of a war. It was merely a brief pause before the next one. Veni, Vidi, Vici was not just a boast, it was a warning. A warning to those who still opposed him. A warning that he was coming back, and when he did, Rome itself would have to choose, submit to Caesar or be destroyed. Julius Caesar's victory at Zela was more than just a battle. It was a demonstration of how history can be shaped by speed, decisiveness, and perception. His three-word message has survived for over 2,000 years, not just because of its simplicity, but because of what it represented, the sheer willpower of a man who refused to be stopped. And as Caesar returned to Rome, he knew that his greatest challenge was yet to come. Rome awaits, the next stage of Caesar's civil war. The battlefield at Zela had been wiped clean of enemies. The east was secure, Pharnaces had fled, and Caesar's campaign had lasted mere days. But while the dust of war settled in Pontus, another storm raged in the west. Rome was not at peace. In fact, it was teetering on the edge of total collapse. The civil war that had begun between Caesar and Pompey had fractured the Republic beyond repair. Though Pompey himself was dead, his allies were far from defeated. The war had not ended. It had merely shifted. For years, the Senate had ruled through shifting alliances, desperate to maintain control over a republic that was increasingly dominated by military strongmen. But now, the Senate was in chaos. The aristocracy feared what Caesar's return would bring. His victories had been too numerous, his ambition too evident. To his supporters, he was Rome's greatest general. To his enemies, he was its greatest threat. The legions still loyal to the Pompeian cause had fled to North Africa and Spain, where new leaders were preparing for a final stand. Meanwhile, in Rome itself, Mark Antony struggled to keep order, his heavy-handed rule earning him as many enemies as allies. The city was a powder keg waiting to explode, and into this chaos, Caesar was about to return. Julius Caesar had fought countless battles, but the one that awaited him in Rome was unlike any other. He was returning to a city that was divided, not just between warring generals, but between ideologies. Was Rome to remain a republic, ruled by the Senate, or had it already become an empire in all but name, awaiting a ruler strong enough to claim the title? When he had left for the East, he had entrusted Rome's governance to Mark Antony, his loyal but unpredictable lieutenant. Antony was a brilliant warrior, but he was no statesman. His rule had been marked by excess, arrogance, and a growing divide between himself and the Senate. His enemies accused him of acting more like a king than a consul, and even some of Caesar's own supporters began to question his judgment. Meanwhile, the remnants of the Pompeian faction had begun consolidating power. Cato the Younger and Metellus Scipio had fled to North Africa, where they were raising an army with the help of King Juba of Numidia. In Spain, Sextus Pompey, the son of Pompey the Great, was gathering forces, determined to avenge his father's death. Caesar's victories had made him both admired and feared. Some in the Senate openly discussed whether he should be declared a second Romulus, the founder of a new Rome. Others whispered of dictatorship, of monarchy, of the end of everything the Republic had once stood for. And then there were the silent ones, the conspirators. Those who believed that Rome could be saved only if Caesar was removed permanently. But Caesar had never been one to wait for danger to come to him. He had one goal: secure absolute power before his enemies could unite. Caesar understood that he could not return to Rome until his enemies had been completely defeated. He had seen what happened to Sulla, how even after marching on Rome, resistance had continued for years. He would not make the same mistake. He needed to eliminate the Pompeian threat once and for all. And that meant war. Again, Caesar wasted no time. He left Asia as soon as he could, crossing the Mediterranean in a rapid campaign to crush the last Pompeian strongholds. He landed in North Africa, where Cato and Metellus Scipio had gathered an army. The Battle of Thapsus in 46 BC was decisive. Caesar's forces overwhelmed the Pompeians, their African allies, able to match the sheer discipline of the veteran legions. As the battle ended, Cato chose suicide over surrender, refusing to live in a Rome ruled by Caesar. His death marked the symbolic end of the old Republican resistance, but Caesar's work was not finished. Spain remained a problem. In Spain, Sextus Pompey and his brother Gnaeus had built a formidable army. They were not mere rebels. They commanded experienced legions, many of whom had once fought for Caesar before switching sides. The war in Spain was brutal. The Pompeians had the advantage of terrain and local support, but Caesar fought with a desperation that had not been seen since his early campaigns in Gaul. He personally led charges, exposing himself to danger, fighting not just for Rome, but for his own survival. At the Battle of Mundae in 45 BC, the final Pompeian army was destroyed. Gnaeus Pompey was captured and executed. Sextus Pompey fled, but his cause was lost. For the first time in years, the civil war was over. There were no more rivals, no more enemies, no more opposition. Julius Caesar was now the undisputed master of Rome. Looking back, Caesar's lightning campaign against Pharnaces had been more than just a battle. It had been a blueprint for how he would fight every war afterward. Speed over strategy. Caesar did not engage in long campaigns. He moved fast, struck hard, and ended wars before they could begin. Psychological warfare. His name alone was a weapon. Fear made battles easier to win. His enemies lost before they even fought. Absolute authority. Caesar proved that Rome no longer needed Senate approval for war. He fought and won wars by his own command. The phrase Veni, Vidi, Vici was more than just words. It was a model for leadership, one that future rulers, from Augustus to Napoleon, would try to imitate. But it also foreshadowed Caesar's own fate. With his enemies defeated, Caesar returned to Rome in triumph. But something had changed. He was no longer just a general, no longer just a consul. He was something more. The Senate granted him unprecedented power. He was declared dictator for life, a title that had never existed before in Rome. But the very thing that made him great also made him vulnerable. His victories had been too absolute, his power too great, his ambition too obvious. The Republic could no longer function under his rule, but neither could it survive without him. Had he left any path for compromise? And so, in the halls of the Senate, a different kind of war was brewing. Not a war of legions, but of daggers. Because there were those who believed that Rome could only be saved if Julius Caesar died. Julius Caesar had spent his life defying the odds. He had fought battles no one thought he could win, had crossed rivers no one thought he would dare, and had crushed enemies no one thought he could defeat. But his greatest victory led to his greatest downfall. Rome had always been ruled by many. Caesar had made it a Rome of one, and that was something Rome could not accept. The war was over, but the true battle had only just begun.